Now we're going to begin to define some things that will ultimately become what I like to call our cost curves. The first of these is called fixed costs. Fixed costs. And we will abbreviate that going forward with FC. And FC represents the bills that have to be paid in the time period that we're looking at for the firm. And these have to be paid whether anything is produced or not. So things like the rent, even if the store doesn't open, as has often been the case like with the coronavirus and the quarantine, things have been due, and then legislation came along to try to alleviate that, but bills have been due even if production was zero. Those bills represent what fixed cost represents, those bills that have to be paid independent of production. Variable costs, we abbreviate that with VC, these vary, and what do they vary with? The amount that's produced. Now I have just drawn that production function with output as a function of labor. Our costs are not a function of labor. Labor is a driver of cost, sure. It's usually a variable cost. But it isn't our control variable in our model, only in that model. Put that aside. Going forward, the control variable is quantity. Quantity is going to be the thing that drives variable costs. How much? The greater the quantity, the greater the variable costs. That's the relationship that we're talking about there. So these are the bills that are paid as production increases. So we're talking about donuts, sugar, flour, the little sprinkles and the crunchies. The more donuts that are made, the more of this has to be purchased. So these vary with production. In the description we just showed with the workers coming in, labor is a variable cost because it's moving with production. Production was going up to bring in that labor, so labor was a variable cost. The rent on the space, that was a fixed cost. Now we only have these two categories of costs. Everything we're going to compartmentalize is either going to be this or it's going to be that. If it's only two things, then what do you suppose total cost is equal to? So that's our relationship to total cost. Okay? Now, our next term is convenient and not a whole lot more. The next term is average total cost. Average total cost is what in lay conversation people would call cost per unit. Cost per unit is average total cost. We don't call it cost per unit because people like me need job security, and it does have a mathematical role here where that is actually more helpful to think of than it would be to say cost per unit. So if I'm saying it's cost per unit or average total cost, what is this equal to? Well, it must be this total cost right here over the number of units. That's your cost per unit. And I think this is a handy measure, but it's not a decision-making variable. Okay, so when Tad is at that fractured prune and things are really busy, there's a line of people out the door as there are at peak times, and the donuts are just flying out, just a steady flow of production. When a customer buys a dozen donuts, and I don't remember the exact price, they're pricey because they're really good. Say it's $8. Don't hold me to that. Okay, say it's $8. Tad is thinking, okay, this is $8. My cost per unit is probably pretty low. I would say $3 or something. I'm making $5. And it's okay to think that way, but that's not the decision-making variable. Okay, it's handy when you're daydreaming about your next vacation, but it's useless in terms of asking whether or not you want to keep the store open when things have slowed down. A lot of people watching this will have worked in restaurants. I've worked in restaurants. And in restaurants, you really see this happening. At the end of the night, as things are slowing down, what happens to servers at a restaurant? They get cut. Usually you can opt in if you want to, at least by my experience, and say, I'll go home. And that is because the volume is down and there just aren't that many people coming in the store. So paying a full staff when there aren't that many people coming in doesn't make sense. So some people opt to go out. Why is that? Because now we have those low marginal product of labor. We're on the flat part of the curve because we're at full staff, but revenue is down. And those costs per worker are constant, right? Wages, the firm still has to pay wages for those workers. So they want to reduce those workers because revenue is down at the end of the night. That's working backwards from the costs up, I suppose we could say. So what I'm getting at is a term called marginal costs. We abbreviate with MC. And the marginal costs in mathematical terms is the change. Here's the triangle for change. That's all that is, just means change. And total cost over the change in quantity. So let me see if this is probably a little scary, but let's put it back to the restaurant thing. If things are slow, it's going to be a while before another table is served or another entree is going to come out of the kitchen. So the change in quantity is pretty low. With full staff in place, working backwards, we can decrease total cost by letting staff go home, by cutting. The reason that we want to do that is because marginal costs are very high at full staff. Or if we work, let me work forward now. The marginal cost represents how much it would cost to add another server. So when things are slow, we want to reduce those marginal costs because the marginal revenue is going to be very slow, which we're not on marginal revenue yet, but there's not many customers coming in the door. So that's what it is mathematically, and that's one attempt at explaining it, but that's not my best explanation that I've ever come up with. Let me look at this yet another way. As we added workers to our production function, we were increasing output at a decreasing rate. But those workers cost us some flat wage per worker. So every time I added a worker, my total costs were rising according to the wage, but they were producing output at a decreasing rate. So these were rising, this top was rising fast relative to this rising bottom rising slowly. So marginal costs are rising very fast, particularly at the top of that production function, because each worker doesn't bring that much more to the table as we add more and more workers. Marginal cost is the decision-making variable because, going back to the fractured prune, when things are slow there, Tad isn't going to use the easy calculation anymore. Tad is going to be thinking, it's going to be another 15 minutes at least before somebody comes back in the door, and I have a full staff here. So in 15 minutes, I might be able to sell $8, but I'm paying like 5 or 6 people $10 a piece an hour. It's going to cost me more for that unit than that unit is going to bring me. I need to shut the door and turn the sign around and say closed. So remember our 10 principles. One of them was that rational people think at the margin. This is that being applied. Marginal cost, that drives decisions. Average total cost is convenient, but this is where we decide this is what we use, part of what we use, to decide what the firm is going to do. So this is the one where the action is. This is the decision maker. This is necessary, but it's convenient more than anything. So now that that's hopefully explained, I'm going to stop this video